Hello, welcome to this webinar on trauma-aware schools. My name is Nicole Buck, and I'm a school psychologist at Manitoba First Nations Education Resource Center. This webinar is the first of a series on trauma. In this webinar, I'll be covering what trauma is, its prevalence, and how it impacts trauma-affected children and youth. I would like to start off by saying that I recognize that I was trained in a Western type of way, and that I am open to incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing into my practices. I want to invite those watching that if there are complementary to traditional teachings that you see or I should know about, you are welcome to let me know by phone or email. My contact information will be available at the end of the webinar. I also want to caution that trauma is a sensitive topic. Some material in this webinar may be difficult depending on what you've experienced in your own life. If at any point it feels too much for you, feel free to step away from the video, get a drink of water, speak to someone, or do a calming activity. Whether you've experienced something similar or have been a bystander, this topic can bring up uncomfortable emotions, and that is normal. Okay, so trauma and how it affects students has become a very important topic in education, leaving many schools wanting to become trauma-informed. Becoming trauma-informed is a process, and it requires moving through a series of stages. Stage 1 is becoming trauma-aware. This involves learning what trauma is, its prevalence, and its possible impact on an individual. Stage 2 is becoming trauma-sensitive. Those who are trauma sensitive can recognize trauma responses in a specific setting, such as a classroom, and they are knowledgeable of strategies for working effectively with trauma-affected individuals. Stage 3 and 4 are becoming trauma responsive and trauma informed. This involves making a commitment to changing an entire school's practices, policies, and culture. This type of change requires that all school staff modify what they do, and this is based on their understanding of the impact of trauma and the specific needs of students affected by trauma. These stages will vary from school to school and require direct training and leadership. Therefore, it's important to note that you or your school will not be trauma-informed by watching this webinar series alone. Rather, watching these webinars will act as stepping stones towards becoming trauma-informed. So in this webinar, you will be stepping into stage 1, becoming trauma-aware. All right, so jumping right into it. So over the years, trauma has become a popular topic, leading to multiple definitions of what it is. Here's one definition from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Now, there are two parts of this definition I want you to notice. First is that trauma is not defined by the event itself. More so, trauma looks at how an individual responds to an experience and its effect on the individual. The second part I want you to notice is the mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being is adversely affected by trauma. Using a First Nations lens, this means that for each of the 4 quadrants of the medicine wheel, mind, emotion, body, spirit, that represents the elements essential for growth and development, it's negatively impacted by trauma. Further, these 4 elements are all interconnected. So even if one of these elements is affected, the others will likely be as well. So overall, trauma has the potential of adversely affecting an individual as a whole. All right, so trauma can be divided into different categories or types. These types discuss here are important for school staff to be aware of. So first, we have acute trauma. And this represents a single traumatic event that is limited in time. So for example, acute trauma could come from in a form of experiencing a house fire, a car accident, a major injury, or a natural disaster. Chronic trauma is repeated and prolonged exposure to one or more traumatic events. An example of this may include witnessing or being a victim of domestic violence, having a loved one go develop an illness and having them pass away, experiencing war, or perhaps going through a pandemic. Complex trauma is similar to chronic trauma in that it can be repeated or prolonged exposure to a traumatic event. However, it's different in that it refers specifically to a child's exposure to a traumatic event, and it's interpersonal in nature. This means that the child is being exposed to this traumatic event by someone they know, usually a trusted adult or a caregiver. For an example, complex trauma would arise from being physically, emotionally, or sexually abused or neglected by a caregiver. System-induced trauma is trauma that is created by organized systems. So example would be a child being apprehended by a child and family services agency. Another example is an adolescent being admitted to a juvenile detention facility. And lastly, we have intergenerational trauma, which is when unresolved traumas are passed down generations. More specifically, after a first generation of survivors experiences trauma, they are able to transfer their trauma to their children and future generations of offspring. A well-known example of intergenerational trauma among First Nations is the lasting effects of residential school and the 60s scoop. Okay, so when looking at trauma, it's crucial to look at adversity and chronic stress. Adversity is difficult situations or events that many people face. Chronic stress often comes with adversity and trauma. Chronic stress is severe, persistent, and prolonged stress that negatively affects health and well-being. A few examples of adversity that are chronically stressful for a child or youth include living in poverty, living in a high crime or violent community, dealing with parental separation or divorce, family substance abuse in the home, having a parent who is incarcerated, and living with a family member with a mental illness or disability of some sort. Adversity is not necessarily traumatic. However, the presence of a difficult situations and experiencing chronic stress often increases the probability of a traumatic event occurring. Okay, so everyone responds differently to adversity and trauma. This is important to keep in mind. For instance, a 6-year-old and a 16-year-old can experience the same event, but will likely respond very differently. In the same vein, what may be stressful for me may not be stressful for you. How people respond to such events varies due to their genetics, age, personality, previous history of trauma, culture, their accessibility to social support, and their degree of resilience. Therefore, it's very challenging to predict how one will respond to an experience. All right, so you may be thinking by now, why is it important for schools to become trauma aware? One reason is that many children and youth experience adversity and trauma. So here are some Canadian statistics to help you get an idea of the prevalence. So approximately 47% of status First Nations children live in poverty, with Manitoba and Saskatchewan having the highest child poverty rates for status First Nations children. In Manitoba, 87% of children in foster care under the age of 14 are Indigenous. Looking at more general Canadian statistics, 52% of victims of domestic violence reported that their child had witnessed at least one violent episode. In a different Canadian study, researchers looked at 16,000 maltreatment cases. 34% of the maltreatment investigations were due to exposure to partner violence. 34% of investigations were for child neglect, 20% child abuse, 9% emotional abuse, and 3% sexual abuse. So as you can see, adversity and trauma among children and youth is quite prevalent. Many of the students that attend your school have some heavy things on their plate that they're dealing with outside of school. Now, there are a few times throughout this webinar, I would like you to stop the video and reflect on the information presented. Reflections will help raise your awareness and your understanding. Also, this is maybe a good time for those who may be feeling overwhelmed to take a break and do a self-care activity. For those of you who are ready to reflect, think about your initial response to the statistics that were just presented. Are you surprised by how prevalent trauma and adversity is among children and youth? Why or why not? The second reason why it's important to become trauma aware is because children and youth have fewer coping strategies and resources to draw upon. These strategies and resources are simply not yet developed. Instead, what children and youth do is rely on the adults that are around them. This can be parents, teachers, elders, and these people help navigate these stressful times and support their social emotional development. Now, with that being said, I'd like you to stop and take a moment to reflect on this quote here. It is an ultimate irony that at a time when the human is most vulnerable to the effects of trauma during infancy and childhood, adults generally presume the most resilience. So what is this quote saying? Do you believe it to be true? Take a moment right here. When I came across this quote, it really resonated with me. Often, children and youth who are facing adversity or experience a traumatic event don't receive adequate support from adults. The reason for this is not because adults don't want to give their support. It's more so that adults don't recognize or maybe they dismiss how the situation may negatively impact a child. So for instance, have you ever heard someone say after something bad happened to a child, she's too young to understand? It's a good thing he's little, he probably won't remember it. He just needs to pull up the socks, he'll turn out okay. Now, this sort of thinking can be quite harmful. Which brings me to the third reason why it's important to become trauma aware. Chronic stress and trauma can have severe debilitating effects on children's development that can affect their health and well-being for a lifetime. A well-known study looked into this effect. Folletti and colleagues in 1998 asked adults how many of these 8 adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, or ACEs for short, they had experienced during their childhood. And they looked at these adults' lifetime outcomes, or their outcomes over their lifetime. Now, these aren't the only adverse childhood experiences out there. These are just the ones that the researchers decided to include. in their study. So, adults had to check off if they experienced any of these as a child: substance abuse in the home, parental separation or divorce, mental illness in the home, witnessed domestic violence, having a suicidal household member, death of a parent or another loved one, parental incarceration, abuse, psychological, physical or sexual, or neglect, emotional or physical. Now, their tally represented their score. So, for example, if they had experienced none of these ACEs, they had score 0. If they experienced all of these ACEs, they had a score of 8. Now, what these researchers found was that the higher the adult's ACE score, the higher the likelihood of having physical or mental health issues later in life. This study has been replicated many times, and the results consistently show that the higher the ACE score, the higher the likelihood of having a disrupted nervous, hormonal, and immune development, having a higher likelihood of social, emotional, and learning problems in school. There is an increased risk of adopting health-harming behavior, such as alcoholism, drug abuse, smoking, physical inactivity, and severe obesity. Further, there's an increased risk of developing disease and disabilities, such as heart disease, diabetes, cancer, chronic lung disease, liver disease, mental distress, and depression. And lastly, the higher the ACE score, the person is at an increased risk of early death. So that's a lot to take in. So I'd like you to take another moment to stop and reflect on this question. How many of your students have an ACE score of 1, 2, 3, or more? This is also a good time for those who are feeling overwhelmed to take a step back and take care of yourself. So, how exactly does exposure to adversity and trauma have this big of an effect on well-being over a lifetime? Well, the chronic stress that comes with living through adversity and trauma has detrimental effects on the brain and the body. You see, in the event of a stressful or traumatizing experience, our body automatically triggers a flow of biological reactions that helps us prepare for survival. The stress hormone cortisol is released in the body, and many enter a heightened state of alert known as fight, flight, or freeze. So in this example, there's someone who has encountered a bear in the bush, and the body may react by fighting the bear. They may run away from the bear to avoid or escape the situation, and this is also known as flight. Or maybe they will freeze, unable to think or determine their course of action, kind of like the song, "Should I stay or should I go?" Okay, so this automatic biological reaction is meant to be temporary. You have probably felt this before in your own life. So have you ever had anyone jump out at you in a funny attempt to scare you? You probably felt your heart start to beat really fast. Maybe your breathing rate increased a little bit. Your survival response kicked in, and you reacted by running away, or maybe you punched your friend before you realized it was them, or maybe you froze because they just got you that good. This is that automatic biological reaction, that survival response that is innate in all of us. Now, once you realize it was only your friend, you start to feel your body return to normal. It probably took about 2 minutes for your heart to stop racing. However, something you don't necessarily notice is that it's taking approximately 30 minutes for the stress hormone cortisol to start dissipating from the body. So my question is, what happens when a child or youth experiences chronic stress? The severe, persistent, prolonged stress that comes with adversity and trauma. This biological reaction here, it's no longer temporary. It becomes prolonged. There is an abnormally large amount of cortisol staying much longer in the body than it's supposed to. Now, for children, this chronic stress is having a big impact on their developing brains, both structurally and functionally. The amygdala, the fear response center, it's overworked. It becomes enlarged. It makes it difficult for these children to modulate their levels of arousal. So they might exhibit unregulated fight, flight, and freeze reactions in non-dangerous environments, such as a classroom. Since the amygdala is enlarging, the hippocampus is shrinking. This impacts memory and makes it challenging for these children to overcome stress responses. The prefrontal cortex, it's also inhibited, resulting in difficulties with attention, impulse control, and executive functioning, all things that are very important for school. Okay, now this is a visual of what chronic stress from adversity and trauma can do to a developing brain. The photo shows two CT scans of brains belonging to two children of the same age. One is the brain of a toddler who has experienced extreme neglect while living in an orphanage, and one is a brain of a toddler with a happy home life. The one on the left is the image of a healthy 3-year-old with an average-sized head. But on the scan on the right, you can clearly see the brain has significantly less structure and is much smaller. It is the brain of a 3-year-old who has suffered extreme emotional trauma and neglect. So as you can see, when a child is experiencing prolonged stress, their brain switches its operation to survival rather than development. It's images like these that many people view trauma more as a brain injury. Okay, I'd like you to take a moment to reflect on this question here. Are you surprised by the effects of trauma and adversity? Why or why not? Does this change your perspective on how to work with students? And if so, how? Again, feel free to take a break if you feel overwhelmed. Now, how do we take all of this information and bring it with us into schools? To start, it's going to be about just being aware. Just being aware that there will be students in your school, in your classroom, that face trauma and adversity. It's also going to be about being aware that the school setting is likely going to be the environment in which you're going to see the immediate effects of adversity and trauma. All right. So the mixture of having emotional problems from the trauma and the structural and functional brain development changes discussed earlier can negatively affect a child's academic performance in school, their connection to others, and their behavior. So what does that look like exactly? Well, a trauma-affected student will likely struggle academically because they have a weakened ability to form new memories. So taking in new information or learning new skills is going to be difficult because they are going to have trouble remembering what was said, or the steps required to complete tasks and things of that nature. Students will have difficulty sustaining and focusing their attention, which will lead to trouble with persisting with tasks, especially if the tasks are challenging. Also, it's expected that they will have a limited ability to apply logic, problem solve, and plan, given that their prefrontal cortex is prematurely developed relative to their same age peers. and just overall, their readiness and ability to learn is going to be compromised. Now, socially, trauma-affected students, their capacity to relate to others may also be compromised. This means that they will have difficulty forming friendships with their peers, and their ability to respond adaptively to their experiences and situations of other people will be impacted. So, for example, they may lack sensitivity to problems that their peers present to them, and they may be unable to listen to their peers when discussing emotionally sensitive topics. And lastly, a student who has experienced trauma have memories that are very unpleasant, but maybe frightening and startling. And it's expected that emotional responses and stress responses can evoke behavior that can be quite challenging for educators to understand and manage. These students may have difficulty settling their feelings and calming down when they feel overwhelmed or even triggered by something in the classroom. They may have difficulty overcoming challenging situations, which can lead to problematic behaviors, including argumentative, disruptive, or impulsive behaviors. Okay, so there's one last study I wanted to mention that demonstrates a dosage effect when it comes to the effects of adversity and trauma. So Blodgett in 2012 looked at the effects of the same 8 ACEs from the previous study I talked about, but he looked at the educational outcomes of elementary school students ages 5 to 11. What this study found was that the higher the ACE score, the higher the rates of attendance, behavior, and academic issues in school. So such as failure to reach academic standards in reading, writing, and math. So looking at this table here, what was found, so a student with an ACE score of 1 was 2.2 times more likely to have attendance concerns, 2.4 times more likely to have behavior concerns, and 1.5 times more likely to have academic concerns compared to those who had an ACE score of 0. Now moving up the table there, a student who had an ACE score of 3 or more was 4.9 times more likely to have attendance concerns, 6.1 times more likely to have behavior concerns, and 2.9 times more likely to have academic concerns compared to those with a 0 ACE score. So the dosage effect I'm talking about here is that the more ACEs or adverse childhood experiences a student has experienced, the more likely that you're going to see the immediate effects of adversity and a trauma in the classroom. Okay, one simple analogy I wanted to mention in regards to adversity and trauma and how it affects students is something that was created by Dan Siegel. And it's the idea of something called the downstairs brain and the upstairs brain. So those who have experienced trauma have overactivity in their limbic area. So that contains the hippocampus and the amygdala that I discussed earlier there. So this area is responsible for arousal and triggering that fight, flight, or freeze survival response. So if a student's limbic area is overactive, so these students are in their downstairs brain. These students are going to have difficulty feeling safe. Their brains are just going to be on alert. This suggests that for most hours of most days, this active limbic area is limiting their prefrontal cortex activity. So ultimately, they are going to be in survival mode, not a learning mode. This is when these effects that I mentioned earlier are going to come out. So the goal is to get these students from the upstairs brain or get these students into their upstairs brain, so the prefrontal cortex. And this will enable them to think, reason, and maintain flexibility, and more importantly, learn. So this part of the brain will also help regulate their downstairs brain and only shift into that survival mode only when it's absolutely necessary. I'll talk a little bit more about this analogy in the next webinar, Trauma-Sensitive Schools. Okay, so this concludes this webinar on trauma-aware schools. I hope you found this webinar insightful and that you are walking away feeling more trauma-aware. Now, before I provide additional resources and my contact information, I want everyone to do an emotion check-in. Talking about trauma and becoming trauma-aware can contribute to some emotional reflections as adults that can be quite overwhelming. Remember to be gentle on yourself and take care of your needs first. A metaphor to keep in mind when you're going through hard times is to place the oxygen mask on yourself first before helping small children or others who may need your assistance. This is just saying that self-care is important and that you need to take care of yourself before you can help others. Also want to mention some self-care strategies that can be helpful for managing uncomfortable emotions. So this can include going for a walk, talking to a friend or loved one, asking a friend or loved one for what you need, pampering yourself, writing down 5 things that you're grateful for, or playing a card or board game. Do what works for you. What may be considered self-care for me may not be considered self-care for you. For instance, I love playing card games and board games. I think they're a great time. My fiance, he hates it. So in this case, playing card games and board games is not self-care for him. And one last thing, I just wanted to remind everyone watching that this is the first step towards becoming trauma-informed, and that it's important to take time in between each step to process the knowledge gained from each webinar. Okay, so for those who are interested in additional resources, the Treatment and Services Adaptation Center and the Calgary and Area Child Advocacy Center has some additional information and resources. MakingSenseOfTrauma.com has a series of webinars if you're interested in watching more videos on your journey towards becoming trauma aware. And there are 2 books I wanted to mention. So Fostering Resilience Learners, Strategies for Creating a Trauma-Sensitive Classroom by Kristen Sowers and Pete Hall, as well as The Whole Brain Child, 12 Revolutionary Strategies to Nurture Your Child's Developing Mind by Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson, are some great books if you're interested in reading more on the topic. If you have any questions or comments, I can be reached at my phone number here, so 204-594-1290, and my extension is 2227. Or you can send me an email at nicoleb@mfnerc.com. Thank you for watching.